I stayed silent for 47 years, until the day I couldn't breathe anymore. I never thought I'd be sitting here at 73 years old, finally telling the truth that I've buried deep inside my heart for nearly 5 decades. But my granddaughter looked at me yesterday with those innocent eyes and asked why I flinch every time someone raises their voice. And I knew it was time to stop pretending that everything was fine, to stop painting my life with colors that never existed, because the truth is my marriage wasn't the fairy tale everyone believed it was. It was a nightmare wrapped in Sunday church clothes and fake smiles at family gatherings. I was 19 when I met him, just a girl really, working at my father's grocery store, stacking cans and dreaming of a life filled with love and laughter. And he walked in one April afternoon with his charming smile and perfectly combed hair, buying flowers he said were for his mother. And I remember thinking how sweet that was. How any man who bought flowers for his mother must have a gentle heart. We courted for 6 months, old-fashioned and proper, and he was everything I thought I wanted, opening doors, pulling out chairs, telling me I was beautiful in a way that made me feel like I was the only woman in the world. And when he proposed on Christmas Eve with his grandmother's ring, I cried tears of joy, believing I was the luckiest girl alive. The wedding was small but perfect, held in the same church where I'd been baptized, and as I walked down the aisle in my mother's altered wedding dress, I had no idea I was walking toward a prison sentence, that the man waiting for me at the altar would become my warden, my tormentor, the person who would systematically destroy every piece of who I was. The first time he hit me was 3 months after our wedding, and I can still remember every detail of that night as if it's happening right now. The way the dinner got cold because he came home late. The way his face changed from neutral to furious in seconds when I asked where he'd been. The way his hand connected with my cheek so hard that I tasted blood. And the way he cried afterward, holding me and saying he was sorry, that it would never happen again, that I had just made him so angry and he didn't know what came over him. I believed him because I was young and naive and because I'd been raised to believe that marriage was forever, that you worked through problems, that good wives stood by their husbands no matter what. And so I forgave him, put ice on my face, and told myself it was a what-I mistake. But it wasn't one time. It became a pattern as predictable as the seasons. A terrible rhythm that ruled my life for the next 47 years. Walking on eggshells, measuring every word. Watching his moods like a meteorologist watches storm clouds. Trying to predict when the next explosion would come. He never hit me where people could see. He was too smart for that. Always the stomach, the back, the tops of my thighs. Places that could be hidden under clothing. And he became an expert at making me believe it was my fault. That if I just cooked the roast better, kept the house cleaner, smiled more, talked less, been a better wife, then he wouldn't have to discipline me. That's what he called it, discipline, as if I were a child who needed to be taught lessons. I learned to lie with a smile, to cover bruises with makeup and long sleeves even in summer, to laugh at parties while my ribs ached from where he'd shoved me into the kitchen counter that morning, to tell our children that mommy was clumsy when they asked about the marks, to pretend that the man who read them bedtime stories was a hero and not the monster who'd held my head underwater in the bathtub the night before because I'd forgotten to buy his favorite beer. I became a ghost in my own life, fading a little more each day, losing pieces of myself until I couldn't remember who I'd been before him. That hopeful girl in the grocery store seemed like a character from someone else's story, and I genuinely couldn't recall what my own laugh sounded like when it wasn't forced or fearful. My friends stopped calling after a while because he always had a reason why I couldn't meet them, and my family learned not to ask too many questions because I'd become such a skilled actress. And the isolation was perhaps worse than the physical pain because it meant there was no one to tell. No one who would believe that the man who coached Little League and served as a deacon at church was capable of such cruelty. I want you to understand something. I'm not telling you this story for pity. I'm telling you because silence is what allowed it to continue. Silence is what made me complicit in my own suffering. And I refuse to be silent anymore, even if it's decades too late. Even if the truth makes people uncomfortable. Even if it destroys the illusion of the perfect marriage everyone thought we had. Because maybe, just maybe, if one woman hears my story and recognizes herself in it, if one person finds the courage I didn't have to leave before 47 years have passed, then breaking my silence will have meant something. But what happened next changed everything. The day I discovered his darkest secret, I realized the physical abuse was only the beginning. The bruises healed, but what I found in his drawer never will. You're probably wondering why I stayed. Why any woman stays. And that's the question everyone asks when they hear stories like mine. As if leaving is just a simple decision. As if you can just pack a bag and walk out the door when you've been systematically broken down for years. When you have no money of your own, no job skills because he insisted you stay home, no support system because he isolated you from everyone who loved you. But more than that, when you've been told every single day that you're worthless, that you're lucky he tolerates you, that no one else would want you, you start to believe it, those lies become your truth. I remember the night I tried to leave. It was 1981. Our daughter was 7 and our son was 5. And I'd saved $17 from the grocery money over 6 months, hiding it in an old tampon box because I knew he'd never look there. And I'd made a plan to take the children and go to my sister's house 3 states away. But he found the money, I still don't know how. And the beating that followed was so severe that I couldn't walk properly for 2 weeks. And he told me through gritted teeth while his hands were round my throat that if I ever tried to take his children away from him, he would kill me and make it look like an accident. And I believed him because I'd seen the darkness in his eyes, the complete absence of humanity when he was in one of his rages. So I stayed and I learned to survive, developing elaborate coping mechanisms, disappearing into books when I could, finding small moments of peace in my garden where the flowers never judged me and the soil accepted my tears, pouring all my love into our children while trying desperately to shield them from the worst of it. Though I know now that they saw more than I thought, that children always know when something is wrong even when you think you're protecting them. The abuse evolved over the years, becoming more psychological as we got older. He didn't hit me as much in his 60s, but the words cut deeper than any fist ever could, calling me disgusting when my body changed after menopause, mocking my sagging skin and gray hair, comparing me to younger women and finding me lacking in every way, making me feel invisible and worthless in ways that physical violence never quite achieved. But the worst discovery came on a Tuesday afternoon in 2003. I remember the date exactly because it was the day after our 42nd anniversary, and he'd gone to play golf, which gave me a rare few hours alone in the house. And I was putting away his clean laundry when I noticed his dresser drawer wasn't closing properly. Something was jamming it, and when I reached in to fix it, I found a locked metal box I'd never seen before. I don't know what possessed me to look for the key. Maybe it was intuition. Maybe it was just 42 years of wondering what else he was hiding. But I searched until I found it taped under his nightstand. And when I opened that box, my entire world shattered in a way that even decades of abuse hadn't prepared me for. Because inside were photographs, dozens of them, of women I didn't know. Women who looked terrified, bruised, bound. And underneath the photographs were newspaper clippings about missing women from various cities where he'd traveled for work over the years. And a journal handwritten in his precise script, detailing things I can't even speak about without feeling sick. Fantasies and plans and descriptions that made me realize the monster I'd been living with was so much worse than I'd ever imagined. I sat on our bedroom floor for 3 hours holding that box, shaking so violently my teeth chattered, trying to process what I was seeing, trying to understand if my husband was just a man with sick fantasies or if he'd actually acted on them. And the worst part was not knowing. Living with the possibility that the man I'd slept beside for decades might be responsible for the disappearance or death of other women, other wives, other daughters. I put the box back exactly as I'd found it, locked the drawer, and tried to pretend I'd never seen it. Because what could I do? Who would believe me? A woman who'd stayed with an abuser for 42 years, who'd covered for him, protected him, who had no proof of anything except photographs that could have been from magazines and clippings that proved nothing. And besides, I was terrified, more terrified than I'd ever been, because if he knew I'd found his secrets, I was certain he would kill me. And this time it wouldn't be an empty threat. I started having panic attacks, waking up in the middle of the night unable to breathe, looking at him sleeping peacefully beside me and wondering if he'd killed someone that day. If there was blood on the hands that had held our grandchildren, and I became hypervigilant, watching him constantly looking for signs, trying to figure out if I was living with just an abuser or something far worse. The next few years were a special kind of hell, living with knowledge I couldn't share, suspicions I couldn't voice, going through the motions of our life while dying inside. And I thought about going to the police 1,000 times, played out the scenario in my head, but I was 70 years old by then. No one would take me seriously, and I had no real evidence, just a box of photographs and clippings that he could explain away. And the truth is I was a coward. I'd been broken down so thoroughly over nearly 5 decades that I didn't have the strength to fight anymore. I just wanted to survive until one of us died. But then something happened that forced my hand. Our granddaughter, our beautiful, bright 16-year-old granddaughter, started spending more time at our house, and I saw the way he looked at her, the way his eyes followed her, and I knew with absolute certainty that I couldn't stay silent anymore, that I'd sacrificed my own safety and possibly the safety of other women for 47 years. But I could not allow him to hurt her. That was the line I couldn't cross, and for the first time in nearly 5 decades, I felt something stronger than fear. I felt rage, protective, maternal rage that burned away the fog of abuse and submission. The day I decided to fight back, I had no idea it would cost me everything I had left, including the one person I thought would always believe me. I finally found my voice at 70 years old, and it destroyed my entire family. The decision to tell someone wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was a slow awakening that happened over weeks as I watched him interact with our granddaughter. The way he'd call her into his study alone, the way he'd put his hand on her lower back, the way he'd make comments about her developing body disguised as jokes that made her uncomfortable. I could see it in her eyes, that same confusion I'd felt as a young woman, not quite understanding that something was wrong but feeling it in her gut. And I couldn't let history repeat itself. I couldn't let another generation suffer because I was too afraid to speak. I started with my daughter, Jennifer, who I thought would understand, who I'd tried so hard to protect all those years, and I asked her to come over one afternoon when I knew he'd be gone. And I made tea with shaking hands, and I tried to tell her everything about the abuse, about the box, about my fears for her daughter. And I watched her face change as I spoke, watched confusion turn to disbelief, turn to anger. But the anger wasn't directed at him, it was directed at me. She stood up from my kitchen table, the same table where I'd served her breakfast before school for 18 years, and she looked at me with such disgust and said, "How dare you make up these lies about Dad? He's been nothing but good to us. He's been a perfect father and grandfather. And you're just a bitter old woman who can't stand that everyone loves him more than you." And each word was like a knife to my heart because I'd failed her. I'd failed to protect her so well that she couldn't even see the truth when it was right in front of her. And she left, told me not to contact her until I was ready to apologize. And I sat in my empty kitchen and cried harder than I'd cried in years because I'd lost my daughter by trying to protect my granddaughter. But I couldn't stop, even with Jennifer turning against me. I had to try other avenues, so I went to the police, walked into the station with the metal box I'd stolen from his drawer. My heart pounding so hard I thought I'd have a heart attack, right there in the fluorescent lit lobby, and I told a young officer everything, showed him the photographs and clippings, told him about 47 years of abuse and my suspicions about the missing women. And he listened politely, took notes, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes, could hear it in his voice when he asked why I'd waited so long to report this, why I hadn't come forward when the women went missing, why I had no proof beyond circumstantial evidence. And he took the box and said they'd look into it, gave me a case number on a small card, and sent me home with a pat on my shoulder that felt more like dismissal than comfort. When my husband found out the box was missing, found out I'd gone to the police, he didn't hit me, he didn't yell. He did something worse. He looked at me with cold calculation and said, "You've just destroyed yourself. You realize that no one will believe you. I've built a life, a reputation. I'm respected in this community, and you're just a senile old woman. They'll think you have dementia. They'll think you've lost your mind. And the scariest part was that he was right. Within a week, the police returned the box, said they'd investigated and found no evidence connecting him to any crimes. The photographs were from adult magazines. The clippings were just clippings. There was no proof of anything illegal, and they suggested, gently, that perhaps I should see a doctor, that sometimes elderly people experience confusion, and I wanted to scream that I wasn't confused, that I knew what I'd seen, what I'd lived through. But who would listen to a woman who'd stayed silent for 47 years and was only speaking now? My son called next, his voice tight with anger and disappointment, saying that, "Mom, Jennifer told me what you're accusing Dad of, and I need you to know this is really hurtful and inappropriate. Dad has been nothing but supportive of all of us. He paid for my college. He helped me buy my first house. He's been at every one of his grandkids' games and recitals. And you're making these insane accusations because what? You're jealous. You're attention-seeking." And I tried to tell him, tried to explain that abusers are often charming to everyone else. That's how they get away with it. But he cut me off, said I needed help. Said he was supporting Jennifer's decision to keep the kids away from me until I got psychiatric treatment. And just like that, I lost my son too. The isolation that followed was different from the isolation of my marriage, because this time it was complete. My children had turned my entire family against me. My friends from church sided with him because he was a deacon and I was making terrible accusations. My neighbors who I'd known for 30 years suddenly avoided eye contact, and I realized that I'd traded one prison for another. That speaking the truth had somehow made me more alone than staying silent ever had. I spent months in that house with him, and it was the strangest time of my life, because he didn't hurt me anymore, didn't need to. He'd won in a way that was more complete than any victory he'd achieved through violence. He'd turned my truth into a lie, my courage into madness, my attempt to protect into betrayal, and sometimes at dinner he'd smile at me across the table, and that smile said everything. It said, "I told you so." It said, "No one will ever believe you." It said, "You're mine forever because now you have literally nothing and no one else." I thought about suicide during those months. I'm not ashamed to admit it. Thought about taking all my pills and just going to sleep and not waking up, escaping the nightmare of being disbelieved, being labeled crazy by the people I'd given my life to. But something kept me going. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the small hope that someday someone would believe me. Maybe it was just that after surviving 47 years of abuse I was too tough to die. Or maybe it was the memory of my granddaughter's face, the knowledge that even if everyone thought I was crazy, even if I'd lost everything, I'd tried to protect her, and that had to count for something. Then one night I got a phone call that changed everything. It was 2 in the morning, and I almost didn't answer because who calls at 2 a.m. with good news? But I picked up and heard a woman's voice, shaking and scared, saying, "Is this the woman who reported about the box, about the photographs? My name is Detective Sarah Mitchell, and I need you to know that you weren't crazy. You weren't wrong. We found something. We found evidence. And I need you to come to the station tomorrow because your husband is about to be arrested and you need to be somewhere safe." The truth was finally coming out, but the evidence they found was so horrifying that I wished I'd never opened that drawer. And what happened next tore apart everything I thought I knew. Aster. The day they arrested him, I learned I'd been sleeping next to a serial killer for 47 years. Detective Mitchell came to pick me up at dawn, before he woke up, and I threw clothes into a bag with trembling hands, took one last look at the house that had been my prison for 47 years, and left without saying goodbye to the monster I'd called my husband. And in her unmarked car she told me everything. Told me that my report had flagged in their system, and a new detective had decided to take another look, had started cross-referencing the missing women in those newspaper clippings with unsolved cases, had found patterns, similarities, and then they'd surveilled him, followed him, gotten a warrant, searched his office where he'd kept detailed records, And what they found was beyond anything I'd imagined in my worst nightmares. There were 8 women, minus one that they could prove, spanning 30 years, all from different cities where he'd traveled for work, all vulnerable in some way, single mothers, runaways, women who wouldn't immediately be missed. And he'd planned each one meticulously, kept trophies, kept journals describing everything he'd done to them. And Detective Mitchell's voice broke when she told me this. Said she'd been doing this job for 15 years and had never seen anything this calculated, this cold, and I sat in that car and felt the world tilt sideways because I'd lived with this man. I'd made love to this man. I'd raised children with this man. And I'd had no idea he was capable of this level of evil. The arrest happened at his office. They didn't want to do it at home because of the media attention. And they offered to let me stay at a safe house, but I said no. I wanted to go back to that house one more time. I wanted to see it in the daylight, knowing he'd never be there again. And when I walked through the door, everything looked different. The furniture we'd picked out together. The photos on the walls of our family. Our wedding portrait where we looked so young and happy. It all felt like evidence of a massive lie. A 47-year deception that had fooled everyone, including me. My phone started ringing within hours. News had spread fast in our small community. And suddenly everyone who'd called me crazy was calling to apologize. To say they'd had no idea to offer support. But their words felt hollow because where were they when I needed them? When I was telling the truth and being called a liar. When I was being isolated and dismissed. And I couldn't find it in myself to forgive them, not yet, maybe not ever. Jennifer showed up at my door that evening, her face swollen from crying, and she fell into my arms and said, "Mom, I'm so sorry, I didn't believe you, I'm so sorry, I said those things, I'm so sorry," over and over like a prayer. And I held my daughter and felt her shake with sobs, and I wanted to comfort her, but I was so angry. Angry that it took the police and evidence and his arrest for her to believe me. Angry that my word as her mother hadn't been enough. Angry that she'd kept my grandchildren from me. Angry that she'd sided with him. And that anger sat between us like a third person even as we cried together. The trial was a media circus. Our small town had never seen anything like it. Cameras everywhere. Reporters calling constantly. People I hadn't spoken to in years coming out of nowhere to say they'd always known something was off about him. Which was a lie. Everyone had loved him. Everyone had thought he was perfect. And I had to sit in that courtroom day after day and listen to the details of what he'd done to those women. Had to see the photographs they showed as evidence. Had to hear the testimony of forensic experts and criminal psychologists. And through it all he sat there emotionless. Looking like the respectable man everyone had believed him to be. Never once looking at me, never showing a hint of remorse. The prosecution asked me to testify about the abuse I'd suffered. Said it would help establish a pattern of violence and control. And I almost said no because reliving it all in front of cameras and strangers felt like being violated all over again. But then I thought about those 8 women who couldn't tell their stories, who'd been silenced forever, and I said yes, I'd do it for them. Sitting on that witness stand was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Having to describe intimate details of my abuse to a room full of people. Watching journalists scribble notes about my pain. Seeing people I'd known for years stare at me with a mixture of pity and horror. And his defense attorney tried to discredit me, suggested I was exaggerating, implied I'd stayed because it wasn't really that bad, asked why I'd never reported the abuse before. And I looked that lawyer right in the eye and said, because I was terrified. Because I'd been systematically broken down for 47 years. Because our society teaches women that marriage is forever and that we should stand by our men. Because I'd been isolated from everyone who could have helped me. And because he told me he'd kill me if I ever left. And after learning what he did to those 8 women, I believe he would have, and my voice didn't shake, I didn't cry. I just told the truth with all the strength I'd found too late to save myself, but maybe in time to help someone else understand why women stay. The guilty verdict came after 6 hours of deliberation. Guilty on 8 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of kidnapping, and when they read it he still didn't react. Just stood there like he was hearing about the weather, and I felt nothing. Not relief, not satisfaction. Just a vast emptiness because justice for those 8 women didn't bring them back. Didn't undo 47 years of my life. Didn't heal my relationship with my children. Didn't erase the fact that I'd been complicit through my silence, even if that silence had been coerced through terror. After the trial ended, I had to figure out how to build a life from nothing. At 73 years old, I had to learn who I was without him, without fear, without the constant calculus of trying to avoid setting him off. And it was harder than I expected, because abuse doesn't just end when the abuser is gone. It lives in your body, in your reflexes, in the way you flinch at sudden movements and apologize for things that aren't your fault. I started seeing a therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Chen, who specialized in trauma, and in her office I began the slow work of unpacking 47 years of damage, understanding that the abuse had changed my brain chemistry, that I'd been living in survival mode for so long that I didn't know how to just exist. And she told me something that helped. She said, "You survived. That took incredible strength. Now you have to learn to do something harder. You have to learn to live." And I'm trying. Every day I'm trying. My relationship with my children is complicated now. We're rebuilding, but there's a crack that runs through everything. They feel guilty for not believing me, and I'm trying to forgive them, but it's hard. And my granddaughter, the one I tried to protect, she wrote me a letter saying thank you for being brave, saying that my speaking up had taught her to trust her instincts, to speak her truth even when it's hard. And that letter sits on my bedside table, and I read it when I'm struggling, because it reminds me that maybe my pain wasn't completely meaningless. But there's one more secret I haven't told anyone, something I did that haunts me more than anything he ever did to me. And it's time to confess. I've told you everything about him, but I haven't told you what I did, and it's the one thing I can never forgive myself for. There's a part of this story I haven't told anyone, not the police, not my children, not my therapist. A secret I've carried alongside all the other secrets. And it's this: I knew sooner than I admitted. I knew what he was capable of long before I found that box, and I did nothing. I chose my own survival over the possibility of saving someone else's life. And the guilt is heavier than any bruise he ever gave me. It was 1987. Our daughter was 13 and our son was 11. And he came home late one night, later than he'd ever been. And his shirt was torn, and there was a scratch on his face and dirt under his fingernails. And when I asked where he'd been, he looked at me with eyes that were completely black, devoid of anything human, and he said, "You don't want to know. And if you're smart, you'll never ask again." And there was something about the way he said it, something about the energy coming off him, that told me he'd done something terrible, something beyond the abuse I was used to. And I made a choice in that moment to not know, to not look, to not question, because I was afraid of what I'd find, and more afraid of what would happen to me and my children if I pursued it. I saw a news report the next day about a young woman who'd gone missing from a grocery store parking lot 2 towns over. 23 years old, a nursing student. And I looked at that picture of her smiling face, and I felt it in my gut, a knowing that made me physically sick. And I went to the bathroom and threw up, and then I washed my face and made dinner and pretended I'd seen nothing, knew nothing, because that's what I'd learned to do. To survive, I had to make myself blind. Over the years, there were other nights like that, maybe 5 or 6 times over 3 decades. Nights when he came home different, charged with a dark energy. And always within a day or two there'd be news of a missing woman. And every time I made the same choice. I chose not to know. I chose my children's safety and my own survival over the possibility that I could stop him. And I've had to live with that choice, with the knowledge that maybe if I'd been braver, if I'd gone to the police in 1987 or any of the times after, maybe some of those women would still be alive. Maybe someone's daughter would have graduated college, gotten married, had children of her own. The guilt of that is different from the trauma of the abuse. It's a guilt that sits in my chest like a stone. Because I can excuse the staying, I can understand why a terrified, abused woman stayed with her abuser, but I can't excuse the silence about what I suspected. I can't forgive myself for being a bystander to murder, even if speaking up might have gotten me killed. Because isn't that the choice we're supposed to make? Aren't we supposed to risk ourselves to save others? And I didn't. I chose wrong. Over and over for 30 years I chose wrong. When the trial happened and I saw the faces of the victims' families, their mothers and fathers and siblings, I wanted to tell them I'm sorry. I suspected and I said nothing, but how do you say that? How do you admit that you might have been able to prevent their loved one's death, but you were too afraid, too broken, too focused on your own survival to do the right thing? And so I sat in that courtroom and I carried that secret like a weight that made it hard to breathe. I think about those women every day. I've learned their names, studied their faces. Jennifer Morrison, who was the nursing student in 1987, only 23 years old, who wanted to work in pediatrics because she loved children. Amanda Chen, who was a single mother of 2 in 1992, who was working 3 jobs to support her kids. Rebecca Walsh, who was an artist in 1998, whose paintings of ocean scenes showed such beauty and hope. And 5 others, each with their own stories, their own dreams, their own people who loved them and missed them and will never get them back. And I could have maybe, possibly, if I'd been braver, prevented some of their deaths. And that knowledge is something I have to carry for whatever time I have left on this earth. My therapist tells me that I was also a victim, that I was operating from a place of extreme trauma and fear, that I can't hold myself responsible for his actions, that the abuse had conditioned me to freeze rather than fight, and intellectually I understand that. But emotionally I can't forgive myself. I dream about those women. I imagine their last moments and I wonder if they called out for help that never came because I was too afraid to give it. And I wake up crying, gasping for air, drowning in guilt that has no resolution because I can't bring them back. I can't undo my silence, I can only carry it. I'm telling you this now, whoever is listening to an old woman's confession, because I think it's important to understand the full complexity of abuse. The way it doesn't just affect the person being abused but ripples out into the world in ways we can't predict. The way fear can make us complicit in evil even when we're victims ourselves. The way survival sometimes requires moral compromises that we then have to live with forever. And I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I'm just asking for understanding, for acknowledgement that there are no simple answers, no clear lines between victim and bystander, no easy way to navigate impossible situations. If I could go back, I'd like to think I'd be braver, that I'd report him in 1987 and face whatever consequences came, that I'd choose those women's lives over my own safety, but I can't go back. I can only live with who I was and what I did and didn't do, and try to make meaning from it now by telling this story, by being honest about all of it. The abuse I suffered and the silence I kept and the consequences of that silence. I'm 73 years old now. He's in prison where he'll die. My children and I are slowly healing our relationship. My granddaughter is in college studying to be a social worker because she says my story inspired her to help other women. And I'm learning to live without fear for the first time in nearly 5 decades. But I'm also learning to live with guilt, with regret, with the knowledge that I'm not just a survivor. I'm also someone who stayed silent when speaking might have saved lives. And both those things are true. I'm both a victim and someone who failed other victims. And I have to hold both those truths in my heart simultaneously. I'm telling this story because maybe there's someone out there in a situation like mine, living with abuse, suspecting worse, staying silent out of fear. And I want them to know that I understand. I understand the paralysis, the terror, the impossible calculations you make every day just to survive. But I also want them to know that silence has a cost. Not just to you but potentially to others. And if there's any way, any possible way to speak up, to get help, to tell someone what you know or suspect, please try to find the courage I didn't have. Please don't make the choices I made. Please don't carry the guilt I carry. And if you're someone who knows a woman who seems afraid, who has unexplained bruises, who is isolated from friends and family, who makes excuses for a partner's behavior, please don't look away. Please don't accept the easy explanations. Please push a little harder, offer help a little more persistently. Believe them when they finally tell you the truth. Because isolation and disbelief are what keep women trapped, and your belief, your support, might be what saves not just her life but potentially other lives too. I'm sharing my story not for sympathy but as a warning, as a testament, as a plea for us to do better as a society in protecting vulnerable people, in believing victims, in creating systems that allow people to escape abuse before it's too late. And in my case, it was too late, 47 years too late for me, 30 years too late for those 8 women, but maybe it's not too late for someone else. Maybe this story reaches someone who needs to hear it, and maybe they make different choices, braver choices, and maybe that means my suffering, my silence, my guilt, will have served some purpose beyond just being a cautionary tale. This is my truth, all of it, the good and the bad and the shameful. And I'm leaving it here for whoever needs to hear it. And I hope that in the telling, in the brutal honesty of it, there's something that helps someone somewhere find their voice sooner than I found mine. I can't undo the past, but I can tell the truth now. And if my story saves even one person from the hell I lived through, then maybe, just maybe, I can finally forgive myself. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing me, asterisk.